Individual differences and features of the violent media input as moderators of short-term effects. Violent media stimuli do not affect all people to the same extent. Several studies demonstrated that individuals differ in their susceptibility to depictions of violence in the media depending on trait aggression and trait hostility. Anderson and Carnegie, 2009, showed that playing a violent video game increased the accessibility of aggressive cognitions compared with a non-violent control group only among participants who scored high on trait aggression. For similar results, see Giametti and Markey, 2007. However, in a study by Anderson, 1997, playing a violent game increased hostile affect only among participants who scored low on trait hostility. An explanation for the latter finding may be that for individuals high on trait hostility, hostile feelings are chronically accessible, so that the violent game as a short-term aggressive prime has no additional effect on them. By contrast, people who are not habitually hostile are induced by the prime to activate aggression-related affective states. Bushman, 1995, explored the impact of media violence on aggressive behavior shown by participants high versus low in trait aggressiveness who were randomly assigned to watch a violent or non-violent film clip. The noise blast paradigm was used to yield a measure of unprovoked aggression, noise selected for the first round, and a measure of provoked aggression, noise selected from the second round onwards, see Chapter 1. On the measure of unprovoked aggression, both aggressive and non-aggressive individuals were equally affected by the violent film, setting higher noise levels than participants who watched a non-violent film. However, on the measure of provoked aggression, the aggression-enhancing effect of the violent film was significantly more pronounced for the aggressive than for the non-aggressive participants. The impact of short-term exposure to media violence is also affected by users' past experience with violent media content. For example, Bartholomew et al. 2005 showed that after playing a violent video game for 20 minutes, high habitual users of violent video games were more aggressive on a competitive reaction task than were low habitual users. High users also scored lower on empathy and higher on trait hostility than did low users, and these differences partly explained the differences in aggressive behavior. Further evidence shows that the more regularly individuals use violent media, the more positive affect they experience in response to media violence. Habitual players enjoyed playing violent games more than did non-regular players, and habitual exposure to violent media stimuli was associated with greater pleasant arousal in response to a violent film clip, but not in response to sad or funny clips. Craigie et al. 2011. The different ways in which violence is presented also have an impact on the strength of the link between media violence use and aggression. In the study by Carnegie and Anderson, 2005, discussed earlier, aggressive cognitions and behavior were higher when the game was programmed so that violent actions were rewarded than when they were punished. See Figure 6.1. Bartlett et al. 2008 varied the amount of blood that was visible during the playing of a violent video game. In the condition where large amounts of blood were displayed, participants showed significantly higher arousal, state hostility, and created a higher number of aggressive words in a word completion task. Similarly, Bartlett et al. 2007 found that playing a violent video game with a controller in the shape of a realistic gun led to a larger increase in arousal from baseline than playing the same game with a standard controller. A study by Williams, 2010, examined the effect of physical similarity between players and their game characters on players' physical state anger after playing a violent or a non-violent game. Participants were either instructed to create an avatar that resembled them in various physical features, such as skin color, height, build, and hairstyle, or they were given an avatar that looked dissimilar to them. As expected, a main effect of violence level was found with higher state anger after playing the violent game than after playing the non-violent game. However, a significant interaction was found between the violence level of the game and the physical resemblance of the main character. Participants who had played the violent game with an avatar resembling themselves were significantly angrier than those who had played the violent game with a dissimilar avatar, or those who had played the non-violent game with either the similar or the dissimilar avatar. These findings are consistent with the effects reported by Fisher et al. 2010 for the comparison of personalized and non-personalized game characters. In combination, these studies suggest that the more realistically violence is presented in video games, the more likely it is to promote aggressive behavior. Regarding differences between passive exposure to media violence as opposed to active involvement, Pullman et al. 2008 compared children who were actively playing a violent or non-violent video game with a group of children who passively observed the actions of the first group shown on a television screen. This ensured that the participants in both groups received exactly the same input and only differed in terms of active involvement. Aggressive behavior was measured through peer nominations, see Chapter 1. The results showed that boys in the violent active condition were more aggressive than were boys in the passive violent condition, who had merely observed the play moves of the active group. However, they were no more aggressive than were boys in the active non-violent condition. No effects of involvement or violence level of the game were found for girls. With regard to the role of gender more generally, evidence was presented at the beginning of this chapter that boys are far more attracted to violent media than are girls. Whether they are differentially affected when exposed to the same level of violent content has not been established conclusively in the literature. The meta-analysis by Anderson et al. 2010 found no significant gender differences in the effect sizes for the link between media violence use and aggression, and findings from studies with all-female samples showed that women are also affected by violent media. Anderson and Murphy 2003 found higher levels of aggression in women who had played a violent compared with a non-violent game, and Fisher and Greitmeyer 2006 showed that women who had listened to men-hating lyrics acted more aggressively towards a male target person than women who had listened to neutral lyrics. However, other studies found no effect of violent media stimuli on women, e.g. Bartholomew and Anderson 2002. Given that violent media actors are typically male, women cannot identify with aggressive media models in the same way as men, which may account for their lower preference for this type of media and possibly their lower levels of aggression following exposure to violent content. This line of reasoning is supported by the finding that women playing a violent game with a female avatar showed more aggressive thoughts in a word completion task than did women playing the same game with a male avatar. Easton 2006. However, a later study by Yang et al. 2014 found that both men and women showed more aggressive behavior as measured by the hot sauce paradigm when they played with a male as opposed to a female avatar. As aggression is linked more closely to male than female gender stereotypes, this finding suggests that female participants may have adopted the gender stereotypic behavior of their avatar, a phenomenon called the Proteus effect. Rattan et al. 2019. The question under what conditions the similarity between user and media characters or the characteristic features of the media characters lead to gender differences in media violence effects needs to be addressed in future research. Explaining the long-term effects of media violence use. Even though immediate short-term effects of media violence may give rise to instantaneous acts of aggression in specific situations, the main concern has been about the long-term effects of repeated use of violent media in promoting the readiness for aggressive behavior. To explain the impact of habitual exposure to violent media stimuli on aggressive behavior, several interlocking processes have been proposed. For a summary, see Huseman and Kierwell 2007. The most widely studied mechanisms are presented in Figure 6.4. Figure 6.4. Long-term effects of media violence use. It's a flowchart. It starts with habitual use of media violence, which leads to observational learning, development of aggressive knowledge structures, disinhibition, and emotional desensitization. All of these four factors lead to long-term increase in aggression. It should be noted that these mechanisms are not specific to violent media content, but apply in the same way to the long-term effects of exposure to violence in real life. Accordingly, many of the general theories of aggression discussed in Chapter 2 can also inform the understanding of media violence effects over time. Observational learning plays a key role in the adoption of aggression as part of the individual's behavioral repertoire. Just as real-life models are imitated, particularly if their aggressive behavior is followed by positive consequences, as shown by Bandura et al. 1961, media models are a powerful source of learning by observation. Violent media characters are typically presented as strong, powerful, often acting in pursuit of a good cause, making them appealing models to imitate. Huseman et al. 2003 found positive correlations between childhood identification with same-sex aggressive media characters and aggression measured 17 years later in both men and women. Moreover, children who perceived television violence as real were significantly more aggressive as young adults. A longitudinal study of Japanese children showed that playing video games in which violence was committed by an attractive, as opposed to a less attractive actor, predicted higher levels of hostility and aggression 12 months later. Shibuya et al. 2007. Observational learning is not limited to the imitation of specific acts of aggression. It also involves the acquisition of more general aggressive knowledge structures or scripts. According to the general aggression model, repeated exposure to violent media promotes the learning, rehearsal, and reinforcement of beliefs and attitudes promoting aggression, hostile perceptions, and hostile expectations, as well as the acquisition of behavioral scripts. Anderson and Bushman, 2018. The more frequently people encounter violence in media depictions or engage in virtual violence in electronic games, the more likely they are to develop positive attitudes about the use of aggression in interpersonal conflicts, to see others' behavior as hostile and antagonistic, and to access aggressive scripts when planning behavioral responses. In a study of 3rd to 5th graders, Gentile and Gentile 2008 showed that playing violent video games predicted a higher tendency to attribute hostile intent to others 5 months later, which in turn was linked to higher physical aggression. For a discussion of the hostile attribution bias, see Chapter 3. Habitual violent video game play was also associated with higher trait hostility in an adolescent sample studied by Gentile et al. 2004. And trait hostility in turn was associated with the involvement in physical fights, as well as arguments with teachers. These links support the role of violent media use in promoting hostile schemata that lower the threshold for aggressive behavior. Media violence also affects aggressive behavior through changing users' worldview. The more often individuals encounter violence in the media, the more prevalent they assume it to be in the real world. This may be explained by the increased accessibility of aggression-related cognitions in heavy users of violent media, whereby accessibility is seen as a function of the frequency and recency of exposure and the vividness of memory representations of violence. Demonstrating the role of vividness, it was shown that the more references people made to blood and gore in their recollections of violent scenes they had seen in movies or on TV, the higher they estimated the prevalence of crime and violence to be in the real world. Because habitual users of violent media increasingly come to see the world as a hostile and dangerous place, they are more likely to feel threatened and provoked by other people's actions and to respond with aggressive behavior. The role of media violence in eliciting aggressive thoughts and feelings is relevant to understanding the activation of aggressive scripts. See Chapter 2. The more violence individuals see in the media, the more often they encounter stimuli relevant to their aggressive scripts. Over time, the frequent activation of aggressive scripts will make the scripts more easily accessible, thus enhancing the likelihood that they will be used to interpret incoming stimuli. Children are particularly susceptible to this effect because their aggressive scripts are still more malleable than those of adults. Disinhibition. weakening the inhibitions against showing aggressive behavior, e.g., by repeated exposure to violence in the media. A further effect of using violent media habitually that is relevant to the explanation of aggression is disinhibition. Exposure to violent media content may weaken viewers' inhibitions against aggression by making aggression appear to be a common and accepted feature of social interactions. As shown earlier in this chapter, many violent acts are presented as justified without showing the suffering of victims, which undermines the perception of violence as harmful and increases the belief that aggression is a common and acceptable form of behavior. As noted by Huseman, 1998, such normative beliefs are an integral part of aggressive scripts and are used to decide which behavioral options should be activated in a given situation. Consistent with this proposition, Huseman and Kerwell, 2007, reported longitudinal evidence that normative beliefs about aggression in adulthood were predicted by childhood preferences for violent media content, and that the normative acceptance of aggression partly mediated the link between childhood exposure to media violence and adult aggressive behavior. Presenting aggression as justified was correlated with higher hostility and aggression, assessed 1 year later in the Japanese study by Shibuya et al. 2007. Furthermore, in a study of German adolescents, Moeller and Krahe 2009 found that the more participants played violent video games, the more accepting they were of physical aggression in interpersonal conflict situations, as assessed 30 months later. Acceptance of aggression as normative was significantly associated with both physical aggression and a hostile attributional style. Finally, habitual exposure to violent media stimuli has a lasting effect on aggression through a process of desensitization. In general terms, desensitization refers to the gradual reduction in responsiveness to an arousal eliciting stimulus as a function of repeated exposure. In the context of media violence, desensitization more specifically describes a process by which initial arousal responses to violent stimuli are reduced, thereby changing an individual's present internal state. Desensitization, process whereby the ability of a stimulus to elicit arousal becomes weaker with each consecutive presentation. In particular, desensitization to violent media stimuli is thought to reduce anxious arousal. Fear is a spontaneous and innate response of humans to violence. As with other emotional responses, repeated exposure to media violence can decrease physiological arousal and negative affect because violent stimuli lose their capacity to elicit strong emotions the more often the stimulus is presented. Anderson and Dill, 2000. Several studies have demonstrated that, in the long term, habitual exposure to media violence may reduce anxious arousal in response to depictions of violence. Research has found that the more time individuals spent watching media depictions of violence, the less emotionally responsive they became to violent stimuli, and the less sympathy they showed for victims of violence in the real world. A study with adolescents by Mrug et al. 2015 found that adolescents who reported a high level of exposure to violence in the media showed a significant decline of blood pressure over the course of watching 5 violent video clips. By contrast, individuals with low or moderate levels of media violence use remained at stable blood pressure levels over the 5 clips. No parallel pattern was found for blood pressure levels during watching 5 non-violent clips, indicating that desensitization is specific to the violent content. In a series of studies with children aged 5 to 12, Funk and colleagues demonstrated that the habitual use of violent video games was associated with reduced empathy with others in need of help. Bartholomew et al. 2006 used event-related brain potential (ERP) data to compare responses by users of violent and non-violent video games to violent stimuli and relate them to subsequent aggressive responses in a laboratory task. They found that the more violent games the participants played habitually, the less ERP activity they showed in response to violent pictures, and the more aggressively they behaved in the subsequent task. No effect of habitual media violence use was found on ERP responses to negative stimuli without violence. such as pictures of accident victims or disfigured babies, again indicating that desensitization was specific to the violent content of the media diet. A more recent ERP study found a similar pattern in the comparison of players and non-players of video games. Using skin conductance level as a measure of arousal during exposure to a violent film clip, Crahy et al. 2011 found that the more participants were used to violent media, the less physiological arousal they showed while watching graphic scenes of violence, and the more pleasant arousal they reported to have experienced during the clips. Higher pleasant arousal was associated with faster recognition of aggression-related words, demonstrating the associations between affective and cognitive processes postulated by the general aggression model. Participants in this study were also shown sad and funny film clips, for which no association with habitual media violence was found, which demonstrates once more that the effects are specific to violent media content.